Okay, so thank you for inviting me along, and I'm really pleased to be joining you, however strangely and virtually. So my name's Caroline Hickman. I'm a lecturer at the University of Bath, and I'm a lecturer in social work and also climate psychology. So I've been researching how children and young people feel about the climate and biodiversity crisis for 10 years now. And that's not just young people in the UK, but also sort of worldwide in Brazil, the Maldives, Nigeria, America, Sweden, France. It sort of keeps growing, really, which I'm really pleased to be involved in and trying to work to support young people in communicating in ways that we can understand how they feel and what impact this is having on them. I also work quite a lot with adults. I'm also a psychotherapist, and increasingly over the last couple of years, and not surprisingly a lot in the last few months, a lot of my practice as a psychotherapist is people specifically coming to talk to me about their eco-anxiety and their distress in relation to the climate emergency. I've been working with parent groups in Bristol, working with a lot of young activist groups, very much trying to sort of examine that interface between mental health, psychological resilience, and climate change, so that we can start to build ways to understand how to navigate this psychologically. I do a lot of these talks, and I used to, up until today, start these talks with a whole range of news headlines. So I would hold up newspapers and say, 14th September last year, failure to hit biodiversity targets marks a lost decade for nature. 15th of September, anxiety in the UK cases have trebled in a decade. 16th of September was a bad week. UN reveals disastrous loss of nature as all targets are missed. 13th of October, 1 in 5 countries' ecosystems may collapse. 29th of October, climate crisis threatens British wildlife's ability to adapt and survive because we're an island. Animals, plants can't migrate. They haven't got enough space to migrate. 13th of January, planet's in a worse state than we thought, and so on. I kind of think that's all slightly redundant, to be honest, as today is the day the IPCC report appeared. So, which I'm guessing you will be aware of and be thinking about, and maybe taking time to absorb and think about. I haven't thought that much about it myself, other than to look at the headlines and think, well, there's no surprises there. So there's no big surprises. I think what's helpful is the clarity of the communication, but I need to go back and look at it better. So what a day for you to start this, the Manchester climate groups. I'm going to start, I have a PowerPoint for you, which you can have the slides later, but I'm going to start with a bottom line, which is any distress or anxiety, any eco-anxiety in relation to what's going on in the world is emotionally, mentally healthy. So if you're feeling anxious, if you're feeling stressed, if you're feeling frustrated, or if you're feeling angry, you're the psychologically healthy ones. I would worry about the people that weren't emotionally responding in those ways. I would wonder what on earth they're doing. Where have the feelings gone? Eco-anxiety is anxiety about environmental and climate problems. Of course it is. So we look at what's going on in the world and we think, it's not looking great. But it's not just that. It's a mistake to think that it's just what's going on in relation to what's going on in the world. Eco-anxiety is both distress about environmental degradation and damage, plus the frustration, the helplessness that people in power are failing to act. And it's both of those things. So if you add to that, for example, how children and young people are feeling, they're feeling even more powerless. The majority of us will feel a range of feelings of power, relative powerlessness around this. It's great that you're taking part in these groups. That's a way of starting to engage and to feel less powerless. But if you think about the position that children and young people are in, or people around the world whose countries have not caused the carbon emissions that's causing the problems, they're going to feel even more powerless, even more frustrated. So eco-anxiety is both of those things. It's looking at what's actually happening in the world, but also feeling that we are relatively powerless. So the groups that you're forming here and then going to be looking at all of these issues is fantastic. It's a really powerful, positive way to engage with this distress and frustration, because action is crucial. Any form of action is valuable, but it's not just external action. It's not just practical action. It's also what I talk about. Yeah, we need external activism. Of course we do. We also need internal, emotional, psychological activism, because to put it simply, we have never as humanity been in this sort of situation before. So mentally, emotionally, we've got no blueprint. We've never had to face this as something on this scale. So because we've got no way of relating to it in that way, it causes trauma, it causes anxiety, it causes fantasy. And we start to fantasize either, and there's a polarity here, we'll have a fantasy of either doom and gloom, apocalyptic thinking, we're all doomed, or on the other end of the spectrum, please don't laugh, oh, it'll be all right, the government will save us, right? Those are, ironically, opposite polarities of the same escapist thinking. And what we're trying to escape, because neither of those are strictly true. It's not all doom and gloom, and the government won't save us, I'm afraid. There is a group who I'm quite fond of that believe that aliens will descend to the planet just as we're about to completely stuff everything and rescue us. Now, I'm really quite fond of them because that's not that different to the government will save us. What we're trying to do there as human beings is move ourselves away from the vulnerability and the uncertainty at the center of those two polarities, because human beings don't like too much uncertainty. And what we're facing here is multiple uncertainties. So the trick with that kind of swinging between the it's all terrible or oh, it'll all be all right, the trick is to stand in the middle of the two. Some things will be okay and some things won't. It's already too late, frankly. It's too late for the Maldives. It's too late for the low-lying Pacific nations. It's too late for Nigeria. It's too late for Bangladesh. So even if we went to zero carbon emissions tomorrow, it's too late for us to be able to have the fantasy of going back to the way things were before. What that means is we've got to face this reality, stand in this reality with courage and clear-sightedness, and find a way forwards that reduces the harm and recognizes that the climate problem is also one of global injustice. So it's local injustice and global injustice that has to be addressed as part of the resolution there. Is that making sense?
Yes. Yes, we've got a few resounding yeses.
That's some yeses. Oh, yeah. Any questions so far? No, we're good. All right. We've got time at the end for questions. So please ignore my messy desktop. Was that a question that I didn't hear? Or do you just want me to carry on?
No, that was great. I think. Yeah, you crack on. I think.
Crack on. Okay. I'm smiling because I'm from Manchester and it's just so nice to hear the accents. Right. I've been away too long. So, right. So this is a short presentation, which you can get the slides from later, on framing, the psychological framing, because it's all very well me saying what I've just said, but it's really important that we have the kind of psychological frame to understand what happens to us and to think about this internal activism being in balance with the external activism. So this is, again, coming back to this idea, is it a catastrophe or are there transformational possibilities within this? So this is a journey from eco-anxiety, eco-distress, grief, to aliveness, to eco-compassion, eco-action, eco-agency. And I'm part of a group called the Climate Psychology Alliance, and our strapline is Facing Difficult Truths. It's an open access website. You're free to go and have a look. I sent Bob some resources, which he's going to share with you. We've got podcasts, we've got a handbook of lots of information about climate psychology. And there's a youth resources page for parents to talk to children and young people. And we're also setting up, they're on a summer break at the moment, but we also set up and run climate cafes, and we run training for people who might want to run a climate cafe. So go and have a look at the website and have a look around. We've also got 70 psychotherapists signed up who are willing to offer low cost or free sessions to anybody distressed about this material. And you can just go online and just book in for those sessions. I'm always grateful to Gus Speth. He used to be the US advisor on climate change. And he said, I used to think top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. And with 30 years good science, we can address those problems. But I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with those, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that. So what he's beautifully putting together is the need for the science and the facts alongside the psychology and the relational. Why? Well, we've had known about the problems of climate change for decades. We've also had a lot of the solutions to climate change for decades, and we've not managed to act. Why not? Well, you can have an economic, political, technological argument about that, but we also have to think about human nature. Just listen to this. We live in perilous times, and the peril is of our own making, and many of us probably deserve it. But the children and the native peoples of this world and all the other species sashaying around in this great dance of life don't deserve the peril we've created. The ecologist Raymond Dasman says that World War III has already begun. This is the war of industrial humans against the earth. He's correct. All of us are warriors on one side or another in this war. There are no sidelines, there are no civilians. Ours is the last generation that will have the choice of wilderness, clean air, abundant wildlife, and expansive forests. The crisis is that severe. Do something. What's important is you do something now. Well, I used to be able to get away with asking this question. I probably can't today. I used to ask people, what year was that written? And people would say, oh, you know, last year, the year before. But this was published in 1991. That's what eco warriors used to look like. So there's the problem. We've known for a very, very long time. So we need to know, what do we need to do in terms of human nature, in terms of relationships, in terms of community building and resilience building, so that we can communicate about this, which is scary stuff, but communicate about it in ways that people can hear us and people can understand. So we're not terrifying people, but we're telling the truth, but also telling the truth in a compassionate way. And this is what we're up against, isn't it? We've got, and I promise you I'm not minimizing the impact of COVID. Manchester's had it pretty tough. I'm also not minimizing because I'm still dealing with long COVID a year and a half later. So, but we saw the speed of response to COVID, generally speaking. It was still pretty slow, but it was a lot faster than our speed of response to climate change and biodiversity collapse. Technically, we could argue whether COVID wave should be in the biodiversity collapse wave. But this is the scale. And of course, if we're struggling with poverty, struggling with racism, struggling to put food on the table, worrying about losing our jobs, of course we will struggle to keep in mind these bigger threats, global threats, systemic threats that can almost be so big, it's really hard to relate to. So it's understandable that you kind of look at it some days, I'm just as bad, and think, oh, it's too much, I can't deal with that today. It's understandable. But it's about keeping that in mind. That's what's important. Paul Hoggart set up the Climate Psychology Alliance with Adrian Tate, and I think he frames it perfectly for us, tragically and perfectly. We are living in a time when a tragedy which is without precedent is unfolding in front of our eyes. We are witnessing catastrophic rates of species extinction, biodiversity loss, soil and ocean exhaustion, and runaway climate change. Keep breathing, people. What's important in here is the fact we're living through this psychologically, and we're witnessing this psychologically, and it's without precedent. Once we learn how to stand in that space where we can accept the enormity of this, and that we're having to find a way to live through it and navigate through it, then we can be less traumatized, less terrified. I'm not saying it's not scary. It is. It's enormously scary. But in the Climate Psychology Alliance, we talk about turning that anxiety and that fear into radical hope. And radical hope is a way of not having a naive hope that everything will be all right, because that's naive. But a radical hope is, well, things are bad and things are tough and things are challenging, and there's a lot we can do about it. So it's holding together the stress and the anxiety and the reality of this with this, keeping in mind this awareness that there's a lot we can do. So it's not a hopeless position, but it's not a naive position either. So I think I've already covered this. We're being forced as humanity down these new paths. We've never been down anything like this before. We've kind of dealt with COVID or faced COVID to some degree. People try and think about, you know, what has humanity survived before? World wars, the Cuban Missiles Crisis, things like that. But they're not on this scale. Because with a world war or with COVID, and you hear it with the messaging around COVID, the communication is when we get beyond this, when we beat this, when we're over this. That is not possible with the climate crisis. We cannot fantasize that we will be beyond it because it's too late to be beyond it. So we have to adjust on a major scale. And that adjustment does not have to all be about loss. It can also be a lot of positives, and that's the transformational possibility. Of course, we need technical, scientific, political, rational innovation and solution. Of course. And a lot of what you're going to be talking about in your groups is those things. But I'm here tonight to say we would be delusional if we thought those were enough on their own. We need psychological capacity and resilience to face these painful truths and look under the surface of this, because otherwise what happens, what gets in the way is our psychological defenses. And we defend with denial. There isn't so much denial around now, is there, I think? But there's a lot, unless people kind of pretend they're saying, oh, it's not really true. The biggest denial, the biggest problem defense we've got is disavowal. And that's where people say, yeah, it's really worrying. It's really concerning, especially if you've just watched a David Attenborough documentary or something. You say, yeah, I'm really worried about this, but oh, I can't wait for COVID to be over because I want to fly to New York to go shopping for Christmas. And you think, how can those two things coexist in the same mind? So with the one hand, we acknowledge the concern, and with the other hand, we say, yeah, but you know, it'll be all right. There's a denial and a dismissal of the severity. And there was actually quite a lot of disavowal going on in the communication about the IPCC report today. Yes, it's serious, but yes, we can still, you know, have coal and oil extraction. Really? Okay. So disavowal really splits these things apart. Now, I'm not saying we can't, but it's the way those things are used together. And what they do is they minimize the severity of these things. It's a psychological split. So I'm giving you a psychological frame which includes the unconscious. We are roughly 5% conscious creatures. This is a psychodynamic psychoanalytic frame. We are largely unconscious creatures. If we think we're in control of our worlds, well, think again, really. We're in control of a bit. And if you're not too sure about this stuff, watch Pixar Inside Out, and it'll show you the scale of the unconscious and the importance of the relationship between joy and sadness. I'm going to speed up so that we've got time for questions. What is an emotionally, mentally healthy response to all this? All of this, but preferably not on the same Monday night. Anxiety, grief and solastalgia, hope and hopelessness, anger, blame, frustration, guilt, fantasies of rescue, apocalyptic fantasies, some avoidance, reasonable, some nihilism. This is very, very painful. Particularly it affects a lot of young people saying, what's the point? Why bother? And despair. So I talk about this as an emotional biodiversity. All of these feelings have their place. They're all valuable to us. What's important is we don't get stuck in any one of these. You don't want to be feeling them all at the same time either. Solastalgia is very much a eco-grief for the changes to your home environment, the world that you love. Some of which, the eco-grief, it can be felt as a disallowed or interrupted grief. People can laugh at you for grieving the loss of trees or grieving the loss of the planet or the earth or the air or the green or this beautiful world. People can disallow that and shame you around it. And a lot of children and young people are particularly strongly feeling the grief and the sadness and the loss around the planet that they thought they would be inheriting and are not. A 10-year-old got really cross with me, quite rightly, because no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't properly empathize with his position. And in the end, he said to me, you don't get it, Caroline. He said, because you grew up, me, that is, thinking polar bears would be there forever. He said, I've grown up knowing they would go extinct. He said, you need to understand how different that is. And he's right. I'm going to give you a few other quotes at the end from children. So I think I've told you this, that we're living with this uncertainty whether we can take sufficient, sustained, effective action in time to mitigate and adapt to some of the worst. This is an emotionally healthy response. This is how we measure mental health. We measure mental health by looking at our capacity to be in touch with external reality. That's mentally healthy. So anyone who's not feeling anxious or distressed or concerned, given the state of the world right now, you can see why I would say, I would worry. Like, they're going to have some pretty strong psychological defenses there, right? So you could argue that not being in touch with these feelings, this emotional response to the scale of what's going on, is less mentally healthy, right? I don't want to really label people as mentally healthy or unhealthy, but on a scale, the more we can connect with those feelings without collapsing into them, or on the other hand, shutting them down, the better. Again, it's back to feel them, but don't collapse, don't drown in them, but feel them, because it's the capacity to be in touch with that anxiety which will drive us towards practical action. It's crucial. There's increased research showing the scale of this, really. There's just a few statistics here. There's loads more coming out at the moment, and I've been part of a big research project which will be delivering results in September, so we will tell you all about that then, with significant numbers of people, bigger than before. But we've got here a YouGov poll with Friends of the Earth saying 70% of 18 to 24-year-olds were more worried than the year before. This is significant. This was done during COVID. And teachers saying they're seeing it with children. Royal College of Psychiatrists have got advice on the website now for parents and carers. They've said 57% of psychiatrists working with children and young people are now seeing children and young people talking about this distress. So you might be sitting there thinking, well, okay, I buy this in theory, but depression, anxiety, this doesn't feel great. So why is this so valuable? To learn to go through this, not get stuck in it, but go through it. Well, this is why. This is a cycle. This is about building emotional resilience. So we feel the anxiety and it takes us, and we feel relief. I'm going to do something. And then we start to go down into the fear, the threat, the guilt, the terror, and we hit the depression at the bottom. And the depression comes around because there's a loss of an old way of living, a loss of old relationships. There's a disillusionment, a sort of hopelessness that can kick in. The trick is to feel this, but not get stuck in it or collapse into it. One of the biggest problems we've got emotionally is the feelings about the feelings. So when we feel depression, we get depressed about the fact we've got depressed. Or when we feel anxiety, we get anxious about the fact we're feeling anxiety. It's the anxiety and the depression about the feelings, which is often the bigger problem. What moves us through the depression to this gradual radical acceptance? This is not a passive acceptance. This is not an, oh, well, what can we do? This is a back to the radical hope idea of, right, I accept this is our reality. Now what can I do? What moves us is grief, sadness, loss, saying sorry, reparation. One of the things I do whenever I'm talking with groups of young people is say, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. My generation has failed you, has failed your generation. And the generation before me has failed my generation. Now, this isn't about blame, and it's not about saying you know, messed it up for us. It's about accountability, and it's about recognizing that we have all contributed to this, but we've got to keep it at scale, right? We're not oil companies here. They've got bigger sense of responsibility than we have. But as you move forward, you can see that on the far right-hand side of this curve, you are moving forward psychologically at a higher level of functioning than when you went in. So this is what builds emotional resilience. People talk about emotional resilience, but don't always know how to create it. How you create it is by going through these cycles and through failure. A young activist asked me a couple of years ago, you know, how do you build resilience? I said, well, fail and get stuck and get things wrong and mess up and pick yourself up and have another go. And then fail again and get up and have another go. That's what builds the emotional resilience we need. It's that famous Michael Jordan quote, the basketball player. He said, you know, everyone remembers the winning shot I took, but they don't remember the sort of 10,000 times I missed it before I hit the winning shot. It's that failure that is crucial. I've talked about these defenses. I want to get to the end so that we can have a talk. I think I've covered this. We're talking about unequal uncertainties. Okay, so you want to change people's minds, you want to bring people on board and communicate with them. It's completely insufficient to tell people to follow advice and give them the science and give them the facts without listening to and discussing their questions and concerns. You will leave them cold. They will not go with you. Science and facts need to be balanced up with equal attention to feelings. I use the Michael Rosen story, We're All Going on a Bear Hunt, to talk with children quite a lot. I'm sure you know the story. It's a great story of a father and two children going off on an adventure, and every obstacle they meet, whether it's a river or mud or grass, they go, uh-oh, we can't go under it, can't go over it, can't go around it, we're going to have to go through it. And I use that as a metaphor for talking about how we have to find, we can't get round this stuff. We've got to find a way through it. So we need to welcome and tolerate and reduce uncertainty. So I've talked about this, internal and external activism. This is quite a nice formula. Feel and think and breathe. And then we understand, then we can act. There can be way too much attention given to, you know, activism is the cure for eco-anxiety. Well, this irritates me because A, eco-anxiety is not a mental illness. We don't need it to be cured. B, actually, you're missing out that whole emotional resilience. If you just leap from anxiety to activism, we need the depression, the despair, the sadness, the loss, the grief, and then the reparation, saying sorry. Then you can fix it. And then you're fixing it in a sustainable way. A lot of activists burn out, and it's because they're kind of all focused on heroic action. We need those gentler feelings too. And then we're talking about transforming eco-anxiety into understanding, empathy, eco-compassion, courage, community awareness, connection, belonging, eco-meaning, eco-care, and eco-aliveness. This gives us sustainable, emotional, integrated connection with the need alongside that physical action. The University of Bath has now got me teaching this material, exactly this, to our engineering students, because they want emotionally intelligent engineers for the future. I think I wore them down over the years. So I think I've talked about all this. Strengthen this relationship with ourselves, our communities, with nature, understand how trauma impacts, understand emotional pain, so we can help people facing ecological disaster that's already happening and build meaningful long-term solutions. We need global empathy as well as local empathy and action. I think I've covered all of this. We also need to confront our narcissistic entitlement. You know, people will say, oh, I want to eat meat, I deserve to eat meat, I work hard, why shouldn't I have what I want? Well, sure, okay. I have some sympathy with that. However, if you talk about it in terms of needs versus wants, you might want to eat meat, but do you need to eat meat? I'm not taking a shot at the meat industry. If you want to eat meat, that's your choice. I would take a look at large-scale agriculture and the impact that that has on the climate emergency. Then, and I'd say if you watch Cowspiracy, we should be paying the correct price for meat, because otherwise what we're doing is contributing to systemic ecological problems. But if you talk to people about needs versus wants, you might want to fly, you might want to eat meat, you might want to not change anything, but what about your needs? And that really just opens up that conversation, and it reduces people's defenses. Here's some of the resources I've been talking about. And back to really what has been, I think, at the center of a lot of what I've been hopefully talking about this evening, which is the truth. The truth is, living fully in this world means also feeling this anxiety that goes with the territory of being a vulnerable human being. We are all feeling enormous vulnerability around this. And that's good, that's healthy. We want to feel that vulnerability without collapse or without developing this hardened, spiky, accusatory defense. And the best way to do that is with support from others, with community, which is what you're doing there. So that's that bit. So I'm going to